Okay. Uh, Hopefully you're hearing me and everything's going along all right. Let's see what surprises Zoom has for us today. Just to kind of reset where we are, we have the war with Iraq. The Bush administration was determined for war in Iraq. Mind you, in that administration were people deeply connected with oil interest. Dick Cheney, George Bush, Exxon is very heavily involved with the Bush administration. Remember that Saddam nationalized the oil assets of Iraq. That meant a lot of money from oil reserves that were that he expropriated, that he took control over and moved all the oil companies out. And that angered people towards Saddam Hussein. Iran gets into a conflict with America. Iraq decides to get into a war with Iran. Some analysts believe it was initiated to try to restore relations with the West that were broken when they nationalized their oil assets. Remember, there's the famous meeting between Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein during the Iraq-Iran War, 1980, 1988. And then it comes to the end of that war, which ends pretty much in a stalemate. Iraq has financial stresses on it, and it wants to increase the price of oil, but Kuwait is standing in the way, and they get involved in a fight with Kuwait. Now, before there is a fight with Kuwait, however, we have indications that Iraq is preparing to get into a fight with Kuwait. Iraq has called in the U.S. ambassador and says, I'm having conflicts with Kuwait. I may get into hostilities with Kuwait. And they want to know, how will the U.S. respond if I do initiate hostilities? And the U.S. ambassador says, our policy is not to get involved in border disputes. And so, mind you, I want you to keep in mind that after Saddam does invade Kuwait, George Bush then decides, wait a minute, this is unacceptable. We have to kick Saddam out of there. Now, if you believe that on day 3, why didn't you think about that on day 1 before there was an invasion and before, when you're asked, how would you respond? I mean, really, that was the opportunity to have taken action. However, America says we didn't take it seriously. Now, Saddam amasses troops along the Kuwait border. The U.S. still does not take it seriously. And so I've got to say, seriously, what do you mean you didn't take it seriously? What was Saddam preparing for a parade? What do you think was going on? He's got troops along the border. He's already talked to your ambassador. You've gotten all the signals you need to have that if you want to intervene, you need to say to Iraq, if you invade, we are going to respond and kick you out. But we did not, which suggests to me that the U.S. wanted war with Iraq. The first Gulf War ended. We had a clear objective and strategy: throw Saddam out of Kuwait. There were many who were arguing we should throw Saddam out now and take back the oil fields. George H.W. Bush said, no, I got the world community to agree that once we've achieved our objective, we would stop the war and we would move out. But that tension did not evaporate. It continued. And the people who were committed to wanting to take back the oil fields from Iraq are now a part of the George W. Bush administration. So you have to understand that when we get into war, it's as if we wanted to go to war. And I would suggest to you there's a lot of evidence there to support that. In the meantime, we are also involved in a war in Afghanistan. The U.S. Could have exploited a split between Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. We had chips to play there. Recognition of the Taliban as the official government of Afghanistan, evidence that Osama bin Laden had violated dictates of the Quran. We had evidence that the attack was perpetrated by Osama. We could have treated the attack as a criminal event, just as we had done with the Blind Sheikh, with the first World Trade Center bombing, but we did not. And so you now have a new administration, different from the George H.W. Bush administration. The Clinton administration comes in and really continues the policy that was established by H.W. Bush. George W. Bush comes into power along with the neocons, and the neocons, they have their own agenda for how they're going to run a war. As Sun Tzu says, war is but a tool for a political outcome. It needs to be used strategically. The people involved in leading the war in Iraq in 2003 were contemptuous of that idea that it would require a plan and a strategy.
In the months leading up to the invasion, a debate over troop levels required in Iraq had been privately brewing between the military leadership and Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld and his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, believed that a force of under 100,000 troops would be sufficient for the invasion and occupation of Iraq. A month before the invasion, the fight over troop levels became public as the Chief of Staff of the Army, Eric Shinseki, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, ignoring pressure from Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz.
General Shinseki, could you give us some ideas to the magnitude of the Army's force requirement for an occupation of Iraq?
Something on the order of several 100,000 soldiers are probably, a figure that would be required.
What is, I think, reasonably certain is the idea that it would take several 100,000 U.S. forces, I think, is far from the mark.
It's hard to conceive that it would take more forces to provide stability in post-Saddam Iraq than it would take to conduct the war itself and to secure the surrender of Saddam's security forces and his army. Hard to imagine.
Hard to imagine. Anyone who had any experience in the interventions of the 90s knew that the opposite was true. You need X numbers of soldiers per 1,000 citizens simply to provide a modicum of security. But Paul Wolfowitz couldn't imagine
it. We're talking about post-hostilities, control over a piece of geography that's fairly significant, with the kinds of ethnic tensions that could lead to other problems, and so it takes a significant ground force presence.
Did General Shinseki get it right? He was asked for his best military opinion, and his experience exceeds mine. He commanded our forces in Bosnia. He did it for a year plus. He knows what he's talking about.
Secretary Powell, and to the same extent, myself, we argued for more and more troops, and we made some difference, but ultimately didn't seem that we made enough of a difference.
Personally, I feel the war would be going differently if you had leadership that really understood, number one, what it's like to be on the ground, had actually served in the armed forces, and number two, really had a good managerial grasp of making this thing work.
The senior administration officials who overruled the military and State Department had no experience with post-war reconstruction efforts and little or no military experience. Cheney had avoided military service during Vietnam through 5 draft deferments. Rumsfeld was a Navy pilot in the 1950s, but had never seen combat. Wolfowitz and Rice had never served in the military. Bush had avoided the Vietnam draft by joining the Texas Air National Guard. He also had no foreign policy experience prior to becoming president.
We're looking at it, I say we, those of us who had military experience, and we would talk about this often. This doesn't look good.
In mid-April 2003, with looting still underway, Rumsfeld canceled deployment of the 1st Cavalry Division, a force of 16,000 soldiers.
It shocked us. How can you turn off that division? If we had had that division following us into Iraq, we would have stabilized a lot more of Iraq just through our presence.
On April 19th, Orha finally entered Iraq to begin post-war operations.
Of the 20 ministries we're going to bring back, 16 of those buildings were destroyed as a function of looting.
We were starting from zero. I mean, if there are no desks, and there are no chairs, there are no typewriters left, where do we go and meet the Iraqis to start working? There was no structure left. Physical structure or bureaucratic structure.
I had to put people out on the street walking around asking, do you know anybody that's in the ministry? Do you know the people in the Ministry of Health? Do you know the people who are in the Ministry of Interior? Do you know the people in the Ministry of Education?
Within the group itself, we had, I think, probably 5 who spoke any amount of Arabic.
We had no phone lists. We had no phones for a while, so I guess having no phone list was not really that important. We had no information. We had no place to go. We didn't know who to contact. Not the best way to start an occupation.
And what followed was this pervasive sense of lawlessness that Iraq never recovered from. And the guys with guns took over, and they were the Iraqi guys with guns.
My argument is that, in my view, this is, the essence of incompetence.
In February of 2003, I got an invitation to come and brief advisory panel that advises Secretary Rumsfeld on defense policy matters. What I told them was that based on our experiences in previous peace operations and on what had happened in Iraq historically, it was very likely that if the U.S. intervened and captured Baghdad, that we were likely to face massive civil disturbance. I suggested that we needed about 2,500 constabulary forces, about 4,000 civil police, street cops, and then teams of judicial advisors and corrections officers. In the end, they agreed that, well, this was a good idea. There wasn't enough time, but maybe for the next war.
Prior to the war, the Baghdad morgue received 1 murder case a month. Within a month, they were getting about 25 a day. They were seeing rapes often for the first time, rapes and murders. Iraqi girls were being kidnapped. So Iraqi women disappeared from the streets. They stopped going to school. They stopped driving.
The Americans were not acting as the police. They didn't know the streets of Baghdad. They didn't speak the language. They didn't have interpreters in sufficient numbers. They didn't have intelligence about what was going on. So it was a free-for-all, and you just felt, oh, there's a void here.
Very quickly, the mosque came in and filled in the vacuum that the Americans created by getting rid of Saddam and leaving nothing in his place. In Shia neighborhoods, they very quickly established control, in particular the clerics associated with Muqtada Sadr.
Muqtada al-Sadr was the son of a famous Shiite cleric and started a bid for power based on his father's network of mosques and charities. Only a few days after American troops entered Baghdad, he assassinated a pro-American Shiite leader. Then he began creating a heavily armed militia, the Mahdi Army, which took over Baghdad's Shiite ghetto and much of southern Iraq.
If you tended to the issues of policing if there hadn't been the looting, then you wouldn't have had people turning to sectarian militias as their sources of neighborhood security.
Orha worked on recalling the Iraqi military to deal with the security vacuum. The Army Central Command, CENTCOM, supported this policy.
What CENTCOM had done, they had factored into their planning the bringing back of the Iraqi army. They use the Iraqi army to seal the borders, to provide static security things, and also help in the reconstruction of their own nation. Rumsfeld called me, and he said, "Hey, Jay, I want to call you. I like everything's going on. You're doing a great job, you and your team. Glad you're now in Baghdad and all that. And by the way, the president is appointing Jerry Bremer as the presidential envoy."
Bremer was a former Foreign Service officer. Like most officials sent to Iraq, Bremer did not speak Arabic, had no previous experience with the Mideast or post-war reconstruction, and had never served in the military. After Bremer's arrival, Orha would be phased out, and the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, would take its place.
We intend to have a very effective, efficient, and well-organized handover. General Garner and I are pledged to working very closely together. He's done an outstanding job.
We set up a series of briefings for him. He spent a day going through what everybody was doing, and then he took charge. I came home like 3rd or 4th or 5th of June.
Between May 1st and his departure for Iraq on May 10th, Bremer worked at the Pentagon and met frequently with Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Undersecretary Doug Feith. Bremer also worked closely with Walter Slocum, a former Undersecretary of Defense, whom Rumsfeld had appointed to be in charge of post-war policy for Iraq's military.
They contacted me in mid-March of 2003.
Did it cross your mind to think, isn't it kind of late for them to be thinking about this?
Yes.
Did you tell them that?
No.
Like Bremer, Slocum had never served in the military, had never been to Iraq, had no post-war reconstruction experience, and spoke no Arabic. In Bremer's first 10 days at work, while still in Washington, D.C., he made 3 fateful policy decisions. His first decision was to stop the formation of an interim Iraqi government, even though Jay Garner had been working to establish one.
Jay Garner was certainly supportive of to get some governing body of Iraqis, but this was done away with on the way to Baghdad. And I didn't think General Garner knew about it beforehand, and nor did I.
We had expected, and I think I can say we had been promised, that there would be a sovereign government virtually immediately.
I'm in charge, and everyone will do what I say, and that's it. Understand? And that's kind of the way L. Paul Bremer came across. Much, much, much too hardcore and too mission-driven to see that his exclusion of the Iraqis early on from major participation in the decision-making process was a grievous error.
In May of 2003, we got the legal occupation of Iraq. I said at that time, and I believe now, that that was a mistake.
We want the American troops basically to leave Iraq completely and let the Iraqi people basically to rule Iraq.
The reaction to his next 2 decisions would be dramatically worse. De-Baathification.
I am today establishing an Iraqi De-Baathification Council to ensure that the structure and influence of the Ba'ath Party is eliminated for good.
Bremer's second decision, his first formal order as head of the CPA, purged an estimated 50,000 members of the Ba'ath Party, which Saddam had used to rule Iraq. For most, Bremer's order meant permanent unemployment. The policy also crippled Iraq's government, educational system, and economy, because it purged senior government officials who had joined the party simply to survive under Saddam's regime.
I was walking down the hall, and Ambassador Robin Rafel came to me and said, "Have you seen this?" And I said, "What is it, Robin?" She says, "The De-Baathification War." I said, "No." So I read it real quick, and I said, I don't think we can do this. She said, "Well, I think you ought to go talk to Jerry." So we went to see him, and I said, how about letting us go through this, and let's get on the phone with Rumsfeld and see if we can't soften this a little bit. And he said, "No, I don't have that flexibility. I've been given my orders, and I'm going to execute them." So that ended that discussion.
He may have come in and spoken to me at great length about it. I just don't remember it, honestly don't remember it.
You don't remember these guys coming in and saying, this is
Doesn't
30
mean
to
it didn't
50,000 people and My God, what are you doing?
I just, yeah. You know, I was working 20 hours a day in that period as well, and this wasn't the only thing on my list of things to do the first 5 days I was there.
Bremer appointed Ahmed Chalabi to head the Deba'thification Council. Chalabi used the position to eliminate political rivals.
Deba'thification was so deep that we weren't able to get the government running as efficiently as we should have, as fast as we should have, and you had a lot of disenfranchised Baathists.
There were people who were kicked out of their jobs, even though they were just professionals, engineers, directors.
The technocrats, the intelligentsia, the elementary school librarian.
Being conquered and then losing your job and not having any means to support yourself or your family was an incredibly humiliating experience.
It was Bremer's third decision, however, that was the most explosive. Disbanding the Iraqi military and intelligence services, the most important institutions in Iraq. CPA Order No. 2 disbanded the Iraqi Army, Republican Guard, Special Republican Guard, and Secret Police. Overnight, Bremer rendered unemployed and thereby infuriated 500,000 armed men, equivalent to firing over 5 million people in the United States. And so these men, rather than helping to prevent an insurgency, instead created one.
There's, I think, an important and interesting debate to be had about being competent for, the jobs of government, because those who are entrusted with war-making powers may be people with zero experience or competency. Strategists suggest warfare is but a tool for a political outcome, and it must be a part of an overall strategy, and that it requires planning for the lead up to war, for the combat itself, and for rebuilding at the conclusion. Rumsfeld and the neocons expressed nothing but contempt for that concept. They believed they could flex U.S. muscle, dethrone Saddam Hussein, and leave it to the Iraqis to take it from there. Mind you, taking down Saddam opened a path for the minority Shia population to fight for control. Dismantling the military, police, and government apparatus opened a path for chaos, including a trained military that now operated freelance as part of an insurgency.
In deciding to disband the Iraqi military, Bremer was undoing a policy supported by both the U.S. military and by ORHA.
Paul Hughes had a team that was seeking out the Iraqi army, and he was beginning to find a lot of them, and he had found a lot of them, and we had made overtures to bring them back.
These soldiers, when they registered, had to sign or fill out a questionnaire about who they were, what unit they were with, what they did, what their skills were, what military equipment they had at home, just a lot of information that would have been useful to us. And I was collecting all of that.
But the DoD advisory team in charge of dealing with the Iraqi military, headed by Walter Slocum, had remained in Washington, D.C. and had never visited Iraq.
I said, I don't see any reason to go out there. I can get ready better here in Washington.
And I urged them time and again in my conversations with them from Baghdad that they needed to get over there because there were people waiting on them and on one man in particular to show up so he could make decisions and get the ball rolling. In his absence, I was left with the duty of having to deal with the Iraqi army just to keep contact with them.
The Iraqi army was essentially standing there, waiting. They were waiting for an overture. They were waiting for what they thought would happen, that someone would come to them and say, this is the plan, and you're integral to that plan, and we need you. No one ever did that.
When the war was over, when the major maneuver fighting was over, there were simply no units still in existence. Everybody had gone home.
Generals and commanders were coming back with entire divisions saying, here are my people.
One of the Iraqi officers, towards the end of, I don't know, the second or third meeting, when Baghdad was going, it was in chaos, said, Colonel Paul, I can have 10,000 military policemen for you next week. You just tell me. I took that back to Bernie Kerrick's staff, and nothing was done with it. "5 days after Bremer issued his order, we were farewelling Jay Garner because he was going to leave Iraq for good the next day. We had 2 Humvees on the highway heading out from the green zone. They were ambushed and 2 soldiers were killed. And that was when, in my mind, the insurgency began. My colleagues and I could sit on the balcony or on the roof of the Republican Palace at night, and we could watch the tracers throughout Baghdad. We could watch the flares of different colors that went up, marking where American convoys of certain compositions were moving and being followed by the insurgents. These guys all knew where those munitions were. They knew how to get to those weapons and how to use them. And you've just sent them away and said they don't exist? Common sense tells me you don't do that.
I mean, you had huge ammunition dumps that weren't guarded until several weeks, if not a couple months, after major combat actions ended.
I'm standing there watching these insurgents pull out rockets and mortars and bombs from these weapons caches that the Iraqis had stored, stashed everywhere. And you go to the British or to the US, whoever's there, with your little GPS receiver and say, hey guys, we found like 18,000 million tons of bombs, and there are a bunch of Iraqis there with AK-47s taking it away. Probably not the best idea. Here's where it's located. And they say to you, we just don't have enough people to cover it. And I couldn't believe it. It wasn't the right answer. Go there and take care of it for your security, for the civilian security, for everybody. It's just a bad idea.
Did anybody warn you that disbanding the army in this way would and then was fueling major growth of the insurgency?
Certainly not in those terms.
Nobody said that to you?
No, I also don't believe it's true, but nobody said it. Nobody said.
You don't believe it's true?
No, I do not believe it's true.
A number of the most senior generals came to the Canal Hotel, to UN headquarters, and they were very explicit that the consequence of letting this order stand and of marginalizing this incredibly powerful segment of society would be an insurgency. A Lebanese diplomat named Hassan Salami turned to his colleague as the generals walked away after one of their meetings and said, I see bullets in their eyes. I see bullets in their eyes.
Even more remarkable than the decision to disband the army was how that decision was made, secretly over a single week by a few men in Washington, D.C. who had never been to Iraq. They did not consult with the military commanders in Iraq, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, ORHA, the State Department, the CIA, the National Security Council, or even, apparently, the President of the United States. Walter Slocum and Paul Hughes were re-interviewed in order to reconstruct the events leading to the dissolution of the Army.
These guys called themselves the Independent Military Gathering. The Independent Military Gathering had 100,000 on the 9th of May.
And they already had 100,000 signatures?
Yeah, this was a nationwide effort. They brought me I wanted the printouts, I wanted their discs, and they gave them to me, and I took them back with me to ORHA. I said, here we go. And I told Walt and his crew, I've got these things. They're here waiting for you.
Hughes believed that he had an opening to some Iraqi officers who would have been prepared to reconstitute units.
He already had obtained registration statements from 137,000.
He hadn't done that. He may have gotten He made, because nobody could have gotten statements from 130,000 anybody for anything in the chaos that prevailed at that point.
They had a courier system set up that was running around the metropolitan area of Baghdad, of Mosul, of Basra, and Kirkuk.
And I don't understand. I mean, given how difficult it was to do anything just operationally, organizationally, nobody had 137,000.
Walt wasn't there. He never met with these people. He had no clue.
So did you tell Slocum that this was going on?
Yes, he knew this. He and his staff knew this.
Ambassador Bremer, you had already made a recommendation to him, and he had already made at least a tentative recommendation to Secretary Rumsfeld about the dissolution of the Army.
Well, about issuing the order that he finally issued, yeah.
Yes, on May 9th.
Yes.
Okay.
The 9th of May was the last time I had a conversation with Walt Slocum.
And we talked on the phone before he went out.
Did you ever say to him, we're thinking of disbanding the Iraqi army and stopping your efforts to recall the Iraqi army?
One of the things that I did was just...
Did you ever say that to him?
In those words, no.
The conversation was, I'm coming over, I'm concerned about where I'm going to be living, you know, am I going to have a motor pool with me, my own cooks, yada, yada, yada. I mean, it was nothing about the Iraqi military. And I was giving him an update on what...
So he didn't say that he had already come to the tentative conclusion and recommended to Bremer to dissolve the army?
Absolutely not, because had he said that, I would have been on Jay's doorstep post-haste.
So you guys came up with this idea and recommended to Secretary Rumsfeld without having spoken to any of the senior people in Iraq responsible for these matters?
That it was subject to, and precisely because of the fact that it had actually been only thought of for a few days, because Bremer was going out, and Bremer said to Rumsfeld, before I make a recommendation, I will talk to people on the ground.
It doesn't go well.
In May 2003, the United Nations sent its best expert in post-war reconstruction to help the U.S. occupation. He was a Brazilian diplomat named Sergio Vieira de Mello.
Even though the UN was given nothing meaningful to do, Kofi Annan said, let me send my best. If anybody can carve out a bigger role for the UN, it's my guy. It's Sergio Vieira de Mello.
You know, I was part of his team. You know, I was his principal political advisor, you know, at that time, and we went together to Baghdad. Our political team were all Arabic speakers and with good experience working in the region and so on.
One of the things that Sergio did that is very, very poignant in retrospect is that seeing that the United States had boarded itself up in the Green Zone and was not accessing the Iraqi street, Sergio created a structure in Iraq that was precisely the opposite of the Green Zone. You might call it the anti-Green Zone.
I'm listening. I'm listening to political leaders, you know, that I'll be meeting with them on a daily basis.
We had various discussions with these military who came to the UN and met with Sergio Vieira de Mello and asked him, you know, to mediate, you know, in the dispute that they have with the CPA.
You'd have these long, long lines right outside the Green Zone, but they could not make their complaints felt. In the UN compound, by contrast, it was incredibly porous. If you wanted to complain, the UN was very, very eager to hear your complaint, and Sergio saw it as his role to relay those complaints to Bremer at the highest levels in the hopes that some of these things would get tended to before an insurgency took root.
I'm meeting with him regularly and sharing my advice and my experience with him.
As soon as Bremer had made use of Sergio, had made use of the UN, he had almost no time for the United Nations. And so what Sergio lived through was 2 months of, in effect, being used as a vehicle to get to certain segments of the Iraqi society. And then for his last month, what he endured was not having his phone calls returned. And so on issues like detention policy, hoodings was one of the issues that Sergio raised again and again with Bremer and with General Sanchez, the hoodings of prisoners. Bremer would hear none of it.
the 3 or 4 crucial months after the fall of Baghdad, the two main things the U.S. military was doing on the ground were looking for WMD supplies and looking for Saddam Hussein. The process of those searches, busting in the doors at night, rounding up people, taking them to Abu Ghraib, having mass arrests, had a really embittering effect.
If you happen to be a military-aged Iraqi in an area of operation where the American military went into, there was a good chance you were going to be arrested or interned as a suspected insurgent, just for being a military-aged man in that area of operation. In many occasions, you take the Iraqi man of military age out of his family, you're taking the breadwinner. You anger not just him, but you anger an extended family, because he's probably supporting more than his immediate family.
Whenever they hear the American helicopters or American tanks driving in their street, they immediately wake up, even if it's like 2 o'clock in the morning, and prepare themselves for the detention. Because for them, this is a usual thing happening even now.
There were attacks on the American soldiers themselves. And so they responded to those attacks by going out and trying to find the insurgents. And in going out and trying to find the insurgents, they sometimes arrested the wrong person. They even sometimes killed the wrong person. Once people were arrested, they tended to disappear in the American military prison system for a long time without a trace. Their families couldn't get any word of them.
It's difficult to understand what it feels like to be an occupied person. They point their guns at you from their jeeps. They stop you when you're driving. Iraqis would not understand instructions given to them at traffic checkpoints. They would approach too quickly, they would get shot and killed.
Most of the American units that I've spent time with have tried very, very hard to always do the right thing and to not kill anyone or injure anyone they haven't intended to or needed to. But there's no question that wars are messy, and this one in Iraq, with the way the insurgency is being waged, is particularly so.
One after
this is just, understand what's happening is it's an incubator for creating the next group of people that are going to want to fly planes into, America buildings. The roots of antagonisms just grow deeper, and it's not going to end well. It doesn't end well, but it's also, I'm suggesting that it is laying seeds for events that may happen 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now, that when you trace back to the roots, it'll be found right here.
By the time Rumsfeld is replaced, Iraq is out of control. The country is increasingly dominated by militias, insurgents, criminals, and warlords. Mixed areas are purged by ethnic cleansing. Shiite militias have infiltrated the police, using them for sectarian killings. Kidnappings and violent deaths have reached several hundred per day.
You have so many kinds of militia. You have the Mahdi militia, you have the Badr militia, you have many militias in this country. And they all are very democratic in arresting people and killing them.
Security is terrible in many neighborhoods where the ever-present threat of car bombs and IEDs.
انفجرت السيارة مفخخة عني. أنا هنا ووالدي هنا وأخوي هنا وأخوي انقتل بيها. أخوي استشهد بيها وأصدقائي البسوا كلهم انقتلوا. استثمروا في المفخخات بالعبوات المسلحين أشكال يعني تعددت أساليب الموت يعني.
Kidnappings especially. Sheer money-making gangster stuff.
Kidnapping of a small boy right in front of the hotel. You know, a car just stopped, grabbed the boy, and drove off.
Parents will get a ransom note and they'll somehow have to raise this amount of money in a week.
It's not where you just have 1 or 2 or 3 kidnappings, but you have hundreds, and you get overwhelmed.
وين صار هاي وين؟ باخذهم بالشقوق من محلاتهم ودوهم للمكتب وسيارتهم موجودة ورحلة وحاجيلة ويقول لهم يا من الكرام.
Just has a deluge of individuals who are asking for help or soon don't ask for help anymore.
Why report it to the police? 1, we don't trust them. 2, they may be committing some of the crime.
The uniforms that they use just proliferated all over the place. So you really have lots of rogue elements and people that are using or working under the guise of the security services.
Now you can see people arrested by many sources. We don't know who are they.
Fake checkpoints in the streets, stop people passing and look into their IDs and see if they were Shiites, Sunnis, Kurds, Arabs, and then either kidnap them or kill them in the same place.
When I say goodbye to my husband, I think I'm not coming back.
By late 2006, Baghdad had fallen into near anarchy. The U.S. military controlled the Green Zone and the area around Baghdad Airport. Iraqi security forces controlled areas in the east and south. The Sunni militias controlled several predominantly Sunni neighborhoods. Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army dominated large areas, including the enormous Shiite slum of Sadr City. Skiri's rival Shiite militia, the Badr Brigade, controlled wealthier Shiite areas. Neighborhood organizations controlled many small zones. Large areas were essentially controlled by no one. From a study conducted by Harvard professor Linda Bilmes and Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, as of early 2007, the U.S. has spent $379 billion directly on the war in Iraq. Future operating costs are estimated at $389 billion. The costs of veterans' health care and lost productivity of those serving in Iraq is $482 billion. The costs of demobilization and replacing military equipment, which is being used up 6 times faster than normal, is $160 billion. The increase in oil prices due to the war have cost the U.S. economy $450 billion. In total, the economic cost of the war is projected to reach $1.8 trillion.
I'm suffering from post-traumatic migraines and post-traumatic epilepsy.
It's obviously it's gotten to a point where you can simply say it's a horrible situation. It is the human suffering, the human cost is unimaginable. Add to it the financial cost. This was a catastrophe. It is a failed episode, and when George Bush left office, Barack Obama came in and continued the same policy, which we'll be looking at next week. Okay, Dave, we can open up for questions, comments.
So please use your raise the hand function for comments and ask one brief, succinct question so everybody has a chance to talk to Sal. And hold on one quick second. Let me allow people to and if anybody's got any comments or questions, please raise your hand. No comments?
Yeah, we have Penny and Dean.
Oh, Penny and Dean. Okay.
Hey, Sal.
Hi, Penny. I do.
I'm a little bit overwhelmed right now over what we were just listening to.
Yeah, I was happy when I started this morning.
But in the beginning of class today, when they were talking about disbanding the Iraqi army, it reminded me of this thing that I'm hearing about as a plan for after the election in 2024. Have you heard of what's it called?
Project 25.
Project
2025.
2025.
No, I haven't.
It's some Republican plan to replace or get rid of all federal workers.
Or like 50,000 of them.
Because they don't
Sure.
need that knowledge, institutional memory kind of thing. So that is perhaps a minor lesson that we could have learned from this war, but it seems like we did not learn it. Some did not learn it. So you don't know anything about that?
Oh no, but yeah, no, I do. It's look. It's easy to build up a political following saying the government is terrible. They don't do anything. They're just a bunch of bureaucrats. They push paper. They are useless. If we got rid of all of them, you'd have more money in your pocket because we wouldn't have to pay all those taxes. So it's a snake oil salesman's pitch, and there are people who buy into it and believe it. But with anything, if it particularly from a military operation, if you're going to invade a place, be very careful, because once you unleash that, a whole lot of things are going to happen that you didn't anticipate. It's like I don't know how to describe it other than this. It's like that bug is running across the floor, and you decide I'm going to kill it, and you smash it, and then it splatters all over the wall, and you wonder, maybe I got to clean that up. And it's all of that comes with it. When I say people have to be very cautious when you start dealing with blood and military operations, because once you unleash it, a lot of bad things are going to happen. And when you look at, even if I'm out of the military operation, if I go in and take over a business tomorrow and people are angry who are working there and they like everybody should be fired, understand that cleaning house is not always a good idea. You have to get in and find out what is actually going on. There may be people that you need to remove and replace, but it's not I've seen it happen too many times with corporations where that's what they would do. You'd have a change. Someone would buy up another company, and then they were going to slash and burn, just get rid of loads of people. And they wind up getting rid of their brain power, and it fails. It is invariably a bad way to do it. I would, as an example, I would often work on security projects where we could automate a lot of tasks that were currently being performed by security officers. And in my planning of it was to say that we will not have a reduction in force. We will have a way to integrate people into other jobs, or we'll keep them till they've retired and we phase them out. But if we just go and cut the staff dramatically, we're going to be hurting ourselves. And, there was a lot that you could do without being draconian about it. If, for example, with new electronics, I would want to say we would train the people from the security force to operate the electronics. And the deal would be we would train them and they wouldn't have to compete for the job. that once they got the skills to do the job, they would have the job and not have some, 55-year-old person competing with a 24-year-old for how to operate, a computer board. You can do it if you're looking to not be draconian and you want a smooth transition. It is possible. But when you go into a place like Iraq and you just say, I'm going to get rid of the army and the police and all of that, think of today, what would happen if all DeKalb County police, all Decatur police, state police are all gone? They're crazy out there now driving cars. What do you think it would be like with nothing? It would be horrible. It would be horrible. Yeah, it's a good point, Penny. And the people who are thinking about doing that, they're trying to use that as a campaign theme. We're going to get rid of government as a mechanism for, making America great again. It's nonsense.
Thanks. I'm so encouraged.
Well, but it does come back to that whole idea about competency. I think really we're kind of at a point where in elections, no one really wants to talk about competency. They're talking about, who says the most outrageous thing and gets the most time on TV, when really the key consideration ought to be the capability of the person to do the job.
Sal, where was Colin Powell in all this?
Well, he stayed as Secretary of State, I think, through the first term. I don't think he went back for the second term. And when you listen to Colonel Wilkinson on the interviews, you're hearing Colin Powell. It was Powell kind of took the position when Bush was deciding he was going to invade Iraq to say, you break it, you own it. Because he was against it. And remember, Powell pushed H.W. Bush to have a very defined objective. We're going to remove Saddam out of Kuwait. And once he's gone, the fighting is over. We restore them back and it's done. And of course, he had, the experience of Vietnam, which had no strategy. And so, yeah, he was a voice against the war, but he didn't take it to the point of resigning in protest.
Mm-hmm. James?
Oh, it's interesting what you're saying, because in the case of Germany and Japan, the United States kept all of the people in place. They did get rid of the army, but they kept everybody else in place, and that's how they ran the country. And these guys went into Iraq and just messed it up. And also, the results of that was that the bulwark against Iran was pushed out of place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, look, the Ba'ath Party and the Sunni minority control over Iraq had been there for a very long time. And you can make an argument, say we need to get rid of these guys or whatever. That's fine, but it has to be done in some managed way, not just rip them out and everything's going to be all right. It wasn't going to be all right, particularly when you consider you had a minority group that had power and the majority doesn't have power. Once you remove the government apparatus, those things are going to clash. And what you saw with Sadr was, he was leading the Shia uprising. And then you had all those military people who were more from the Sunni side of the world, who then become the insurgency. So now you got both of them vying for power, and all of them fighting against the Americans. It was just terrible. It was mindless. It was totally, in my view, an incompetent operation. And when you have that and you're dealing with warfare, it's going to be brutal. And one of the things I'm working on some other classes about what have been the byproducts of empire building. When humans transition to from hunter-gatherers to a sedentary lifestyle, and we became agriculturalist, much depended upon availability of water and land. And so governments were a byproduct of that. It was that there would be a leadership of whatever the community was to ensure that water was distributed equally, that land was not stolen from each other. It was to provide some modicum of control. And it's just very interesting. And it emerges organically, and then it grows, and as we become civilized, it becomes more essential. With a world population as we have today, you must have some form of government, and for people to say we need to get rid of all of it, it's sort of mindless. And I would also say that look at the similarities. Nothing is exactly the same, but when you look at the conflict in Israel right now, there's a lot of similar things happening. There's the attack, the response. Has anybody really looked at strategically what's behind it? I think it's the responses are the same responses that I think you can see over the past 5,000 to 6,000 years, and the outcome is invariably disastrous.
Anybody else?
Oh, Joy has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Joy, can you unmute?
Yeah, sorry. Thinking about all of this and what we did right and what we did wrong, I wonder if, and this is just fantasy, getting it passed, I realize is, if Israel agreed to give up parts of the West Bank and build a city or state there in various places, that the leadership, the people who proclaim to be leaders, and if they're terrorists, no, swear under Allah, which they all claim to believe in, that they're not terrorists and that they're goals, and then somehow use that as a carrot to get people away from Gaza. No, I mean, the money is going to come from somewhere to rebuild there. Why don't we rebuild? They don't have the money to rebuild. That could be but as I say, I don't know that anybody would like it.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing: is I would suggest that if I were working with Hamas, and I was looking at the strategy, there were discussions between the Palestinians and Israelis about moderating the checkpoints, making it easier for people to get through and to get to work, changing some of the conditions in the West Bank so that people could have better jobs and improvement. So that was going on, and politically within Israel, although the right wing maintains control, the left was gaining more and more power. So as I'm looking at that, I see maybe there's something that will reduce tensions. And mind you, if I'm Hamas, I don't really want to reduce tensions.
No, you want to keep it up.
I want to keep it up.
Right.
Now, at the same time, Israel is in discussions with Saudi Arabia
Who might kick in some money
to moderate and maybe even be recognized. Again, if I'm Hamas, I don't like that, because I need for there to be hostility across the Middle East against Israel so I can get money from my supporters.
Right.
So, faced with those things happening,
Hamas did what it did.
Hamas does what it does. Israel responds.
Right, and you're still in the same.
What they know is that once Israel responds and it kills a lot of people, Saudi Arabia is going to shut down those conversations. The population of Israel is going to rally to the right wing, and so that what changes were being negotiated kind of get blown away. Understand, for me, that would be Hamas now, but because of the retaliatory attack and bombings, the sentiments against Israel in the West Bank and Gaza are going 2 generations at least before they would be open to any kind of conversation. The break off with Saudi Arabia, that's now years off. So I would argue that Hamas accomplished its objective.
There's not a question there.
And
but
so,
I'm looking for a way to get them out.
Well, my thing is that if these negotiations that were going on were part of a strategy, I would prepare for Hamas to do something.
Yeah.
Break it, because it's going to hurt their interest. Not all the Palestinians, it's going to hurt Hamas.
Right.
So I would be looking to have created a strategy to isolate Hamas and not give them what they wanted, but to further solidify the gains that we had made and respond in a different way. Now, that's not to mean just do nothing. There is to do something, but when you start bombing like that, it's not a good response. It's gonna.
What should they have done at that point?
Yes.
I know they made a mistake. You looked forward.
Yes. Yeah, it's bad enough with my bossy dog, but
I know it's complicated. I would have made it a police operation, and I would mind you, it's very difficult to, when you haven't had bombing and all the rest, to get down into the tunnels and actually draw out Hamas leadership. But that would have been I would look to I would use a strategy that's made to divide the Hamas leadership and pull them apart. And mind you, groups like that, they're not as cohesive or tightly knit as it might appear. So that would have been my strategy. I would have gone more for driving wedges and decapitating them like that.
Well, how do they find them in the tunnels without getting in and destroying and,
Well, certainly it can be done, but it's not the kind of thing that you can just say, well, do this, do that. It's complicated. Sure.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Dave, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah.
But mind you, I would have had a public relations campaign that was going to say, we're not going to act like Hamas. We're not just going to go bomb innocent. We want all of you Palestinians to know that we care about your kids. We care about innocent people not getting hurt. And I would have made a very big deal out of that. And mind you, when you're the victim of an attack,
it's hard to do.
Rallies to you.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, I would, just as I thought George Bush, after the 9/11 attack, could have put a lot of pressure on those Middle Eastern leaders to recognize Israel's existence.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it was possible at that moment, but we lost that. These give you some political chips to play. Make sure you play them. Don't just, you know.
Where are you going?
Okay.
Yeah. What I thought that Hamas was comparatively mellow during this time, right before all this. You know, that they didn't think they were a threat.
No, they have gotten successively more violent, and more barriers have gone up since 2007.
Look, we also have Hezbollah still attacking.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I thought Hezbollah was more of a threat, and I thought Hamas was more mellow, and that's why they were surprised by the attack.
Well, the bigger military force is Hezbollah.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's why.
You know, but Hamas is you know, certainly been on their radar screen. And, you know, when people say this was an intelligence failure, I just think Israel has never had an intelligence failure. I mean, they are as sharp as can be. And I just can't believe that they didn't have indications before this. Yeah.
Well,
James,
we're pretty sharp, we think.
Wait a second, James. James has his hand up.
All I was going to say was the problem you have is none of the leaders in the Palestinian areas are legitimate leaders. The guys in the West Bank canceled the election when they realized Hamas was going to win. And if they ran an election now, Hamas would win both in the West Bank and in along the where they are now. And in Israel, they're going pretty hard to the right. And the problem was they moved the troops that were guarding the West Bank, not the West Bank, but the I can't remember now, but they moved them into the settlements on the West Bank to guard them against the Arabs there. And then there was nobody watching Hamas.
Well, yeah, that's the story that they have, which was because Hezbollah is constantly having fights and incursions that they moved their troops there. But I just think
they had their troops on the West Bank.
Right, I know. That's what I'm saying. Hezbollah is on the West Bank. Yeah.
No.
Lebanon.
I understand, but that's, you know, they were positioned getting ready for more action over there than on Gaza.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Sal?
We're dumbfounded.
Okay, well, thanks, everybody.
If not, that's everybody to unmute. And thanks, Sal, for a very sobering video. And, you know, stay with us.
Thanks, Sal.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sal.
Thank
Be
you,
safe.
Sal.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sal.
Yeah. See how you guys next
Okay, see y'all next week.